Hi, hello, my name is Eric, not real Eric, and in this video I'm going to show you how to connect your original Super Nintendo controllers on the Nintendo Switch 2 system. This is essentially going to be a remake of my first controller video on this channel. Check it out after this if you haven't done so already. The Super Nintendo originally released in 1990, and its controller's form factor and design set the standard for gamepads going forward for the next 35 plus years. In 2019, Nintendo brought back their Super Nintendo controller for their Nintendo Switch Online service. It's wireless and charges via USB-C. It can be found for purchase exclusively to Nintendo Switch Online members on the Nintendo website for $35. It's a wonderful near one-to-one replica, however our focus is using original Super Nintendo controllers. In order to connect this to Switch 2, we're going to be needing two adapters. Our first adapter is going to be the 8-bit Do G-Bros adapter. This wireless adapter can connect wired GameCube and Classic Edition controllers to the Nintendo Switch. It can be purchased for $25 from the 8-bit Do Amazon page. In June 2025, 8-bit Do pushed out a firmware update via their 8-bit Do firmware updater for the G-Bros adapter, giving it Nintendo Switch 2 compatibility, so make sure you do this before you pair it to your console. Luckily, the software is free, simple to use, and can be found on the 8-bit Do website. Our second adapter we'll be needing is the Hyperkin Super Nintendo to Super Nintendo Classic adapter. This will make our Super Nintendo controller connect to the G-Bros adapter. The Hyperkin adapter can be found online through third-party websites for roughly $15. Using these two adapters, you will be able to use your Super Nintendo controller on the Nintendo Switch 2. Now let's set it up. Let's focus on the G-Bros adapter and its green, red, gray, and yellow buttons. Make sure the gray toggle is set to S for Nintendo Switch. Press the red button to turn it on, then press and hold the yellow button to pair. The blinking light will indicate that it's searching. Now we can go ahead and take our Hyperkin adapter and connect it to the 8-bit Do G-Bros adapter. Now we're set to connect our Super Nintendo controller. And we have connection. Now that we're all set up, a tidbit from our original video that's still true today. The shoulder buttons, R and L, worked well. The D-pad, all directions, felt tight and responsive. However, we run into some complications. With these adapters, the start and the select button do not work, and they do not translate to the plus and the minus button. Now, we're all set up and ready to capture some gameplay.
Now you're playing with power, superpower.
The first game we're going to test out is Super Mario Kart, played through the Nintendo Switch Online service. Super Mario Kart was designed entirely around the Super Nintendo's controller, so if this didn't feel right, nothing else would really matter. The steering, drifting, and cornering all feels authentic and just reminds me, this game is really hard. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. What can be said about this game that hasn't already been said by the masses? It's one of the best-selling games of all time, with roughly 80 million copies sold combined between the Wii U and Switch version, and truthfully, this might be the best Mario spin-off ever made. And while the game was clearly designed with the control stick in mind, you could always use a directional pad to control your racer and play like the original Super Mario Kart on Super Nintendo. Now this one is blasphemous. Using an original Super Nintendo controller to play a Sonic game? Absolutely. Even though Super Mario Bros. Wonder is a modern 2D Mario installment, it still follows the same fundamentals that were established in Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo roughly 35 years ago. The running, the jumping, the tight controls all feel perfect with the Super Nintendo's controller. Having owned Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo, I knew I had to try out its spiritual sequel, Shredder's Revenge. If you go into the settings and enable the Type B controls, suddenly Yoshi's Crafted World plays a lot like Yoshi's Island on the Super Nintendo. Shovel Knight Dig is a 16-bit follow-up to the NES-inspired original, and since it's following the 16-bit formula, I figured I need to try out this controller for it as well. Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe is honestly one of Kirby's best adventures, and using this controller, it plays exactly like Kirby Superstar on the Super Nintendo. I am a big fan of Nintendo Switch games that give this classic style of control. The F-Zero series stands as one of Nintendo's most challenging in terms of difficulty, and this latest installment is no different. F-Zero 99 was a real stress test on the Super Nintendo controller. Playing Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze with the Super Nintendo controller just feels right like the original Super Nintendo trilogy. Now, I'm fairly certain that originally Kirby Air Riders was designed with an analog stick in mind, but I'm still very appreciative of game director Masahiro Sakurai for adding D-pad support. All of the games shown so far support the D-pad inputs, making them fully playable without an analog stick, but while recording this video, I noticed something unusual. My Super Nintendo controller's D-pad was no longer reading the same way. After running several tests, I discovered the D-pad was no longer registering inputs in a traditional up, down, left, right fashion. Instead, it was now being interpreted as a control stick. This was not the case just 6 months ago, and I tested this over and over multiple times on my Nintendo Switch 2 system, on my original Nintendo Switch system. I even went ahead and tried it on my Nintendo Switch Lite system several times, and the D-pad read as a stick. I haven't been able to find anyone else documenting this change, so this may be the first recorded example of it. The only variable that's changed since my original test is that the Switch 2 has gone through several firmware updates. I also tested the G-Bros adapter using an NES to NES Classic controller adapter, and that setup does not replicate this behavior. Regardless, the Super Nintendo controller being read as a control stick opens up way more gameplay possibilities. With the D-pad acting as a stick, Super Mario Odyssey becomes surprisingly playable. The movement feels closer to Super Mario World than you'd actually expect. Pokémon has always been a D-pad friendly series at its core, and going through Pokémon Violet with a Super Nintendo controller plays pretty well, even if I'm not the biggest fan of these bases. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is a real interesting one, because this feels like a weird evolution of A Link to the Past controls. The D-pad moving our character, the Y button controlling our sword, it's all the same here. Metroid Dread plays like a dream with the D-pad and the Super Nintendo controller. This is the modern counterpart to Super Metroid, and it's a big shame that you couldn't natively play this game with the D-pad. Playing Super Smash Bros. Ultimate with an original Super Nintendo controller is just odd. Playing Smash Bros. In general with the D-pad is just something that feels so unnatural, and reminds me of something straight out of Super Smash Bros. Brawl where you could play with the Wii Remote on its side. Despite my gripes, relatively all your functions are here, making this pretty playable. While the main game hasn't released yet, the demo is currently out for Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. The combat feels really good with the Super Nintendo controller, but because we don't have a second control stick to move the camera, we have a lot of difficulties in this game.
That's that. Not bad.
The hell is that?
A barrier? Never seen this defense system before.
Thought you were the expert.
So what's your brilliant plan, genius? still in it.
Donkey Kong Bonanza is also pretty playable with the Super Nintendo controller, and thanks to the Nintendo Switch 2 button remappings, we can go ahead and configure the controls to make it feel even better. For example, in this game, we have the L being the ZL and the R being the ZR. Metroid Prime 4 with the Super Nintendo controller is wild. This game wholeheartedly relies on precision aiming and the analog stick controls, and yet we were able to beat its first boss with these controls. It's not recommended and it was incredibly difficult and time consuming, but it was possible. And finally, we have Mario Kart World. This feels like a full circle moment. From Super Mario Kart on the NSO Super Nintendo app to this modern entry, the D-pad still works for steering thanks to our adapters and some sort of change, because originally in Mario Kart World, the D-pad doesn't do anything other than help rewind the character back to where they were. And while there are better options on how to play Mario Kart World, playing this title with the Super Nintendo controller is wildly consistent to how the original title played over 3 decades ago. And there we have it. In this video, I showcased how to connect your Super Nintendo controller to the Nintendo Switch 2 and featured it alongside 20 different video games. I love the Super Nintendo controller, and the fact that I'm using my original controller from my childhood to play modern games with over 3 decades later is a wonderful delight. And thanks to the Nintendo Switch 2 button remapping, it makes playing with the Super Nintendo controller incredibly viable for many more games. If you're a hardcore Super Nintendo fan, I definitely recommend trying out both the HyperCAN and 8-bit Do adapters to get this to work. But that's going to be all from me today. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Eric, not Real Eric. Stay real, stay safe, stay you. Follow me on Twitch and Twitter, and we'll catch you in the next one. Also, it is pronounced 8-bit Do. Look at that.